Okay, so we're going to begin. We'll do again the salutation. Okay. So Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the fully enlightened one. Okay, so finally we can settle in, even in this imperfect world, and so we will start now the Dharma talk. Okay, so the subject of this retreat is the Buddha's teachings or guidance for lay people. And there are two primary reasons why I chose this topic for this retreat. When I was planning to conduct this retreat, I was thinking, should I do it as mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of breathing, moving from mindfulness of the body to contemplation of the mind? But then it occurred to me that what's happening in the United States and in the West, as Buddhism comes to this country, to this region of the world, what is taking place is a kind of transposition of a basically monastic mode of practice, which is taken to be the sort of template through which Buddhism is being understood and practiced. So people think that to seriously practice the Buddha Dharma, you have to go to a meditation retreat, spend a week, 10 days, a month, 3 months doing intensive meditation. And then when you come out, you just return to your everyday life without having much grasp of the Dharma that the Buddha actually taught for lay people.
We just lost you. We can't hear you again. When you touched your, when you.
You lost me.
Your volume went way down.
You've adjusted it. Okay, is my voice coming through?
It's still soft.
Okay, I'm just going to have to go on speaking.
No, this is much better.
That
Yeah,
worked.
now you got
It's
it.
good now.
Okay.
I believe it's the microphone problem.
Okay, so we're getting an echo, but I'm going to have to speak in this way. Do you get an echo? Is it disturbing?
I am willing to have an echo. I am eager to hear your words.
Okay, at least you can hear me.
Yeah, we could hear and there's echo.
Okay, so one reason that I chose this topic is because I felt that it's important for people to know the Dharma teachings that the Buddha gave for lay people, teachings that apply to them in their everyday life as well as in their spiritual practice. So that is one reason. Another reason is because there's been a kind of caricature, or I would even say a misrepresentation of the teachings of early Buddhism as concerned entirely with world renunciation. That especially if you look at the textbooks, sort of college textbooks on Buddhism, you'll have Theravada Buddhism emphasizes renunciation, liberation, monastic life. Mahayana Buddhism represents a revolt of the lay community against the monastic elite and an attempt to develop a form of Buddhism appropriate for lay life. But if we look in the Pali Canon, the discourses of the Buddha, and we'll be taking a kind of overview of some of these teachings, we see that the Buddha gave many very, very practical teachings to lay people concerned with many different aspects of their everyday life, ranging from family relationships, social relationships, community relationships, even advice to kings and ministers of state on how to rule and to govern their kingdoms. In fact, in my early days, when I was first starting to read in Buddhist texts, back when I was in graduate school, one of the suttas that made the strongest impression on me, it's a sutta in the Digha Nikaya called the Sigalika Sutta, in which the Buddha gives a discourse to a young layman on worshiping the 6 directions. And in that discourse, he explains the proper relationships between parents and children, husband and wife, employer and employees, teacher and students, monastics and lay people. So it shows that the Buddha had a very, very comprehensive grasp of so many different aspects of social relationships, and he gave teachings against that background of the Indian culture of the time, appropriate for people in those situations. Of course, when we come into our own modern era, we have to understand how to adapt and adjust those teachings to fit our own situation. But we can find the basic guidelines in the teachings of the early Buddhist teachings, the discourses of the Buddha. Okay, to kick off this retreat after a rather slow and problematic start, what I want to do is to give a kind of overview of the development of the lay community, the historical development of the lay community, not in great detail, but taking a few key moments in the development of the Buddhist lay community, and then some of the chief points that the Buddha emphasized in living the lay life as a follower of the Dhamma. And so let me call up okay, now I have to go online. Okay. Yeah, that's what I want, okay. And I hope people in the back will be, will be able to see. But I'm going to also speak what I see on the screen. And let me try to increase the size. Is it visible in the back? There are some seats up here. If anybody has poor eyesight, they're welcome to come up to the top, up to the front. Don't feel shy or embarrassed if you have trouble seeing. Okay. Okay, so often if we read books, basic books on Buddhism, we're told that the first 5 disciples of the Buddha were the ascetics who had served him when they were meditating together and undertaking ascetic practices together. Yeah, there's another seat up here. So we're told that the first disciples of the Buddha were the 5 ascetics who had served him during the period of his ascetic striving. Actually, historically, at least according to the text, that isn't true. The first 2 disciples of the Buddha were lay people. And this is the account that takes place. This is from the Vinaya, the book of discipline, a chapter called the Mahavagga, the Great Chapter, which it gives an account of the Buddha's enlightenment and the events that took place soon after the enlightenment. And so we are told that the Buddha is sitting in the vicinity, still in the vicinity of the Bodhi tree. And then after sitting in deep meditation for 7 days, he emerges from his meditative absorption. He goes from one tree and then comes to a tree called the Rajayatana tree. And then again, he sits in meditation for 7 days, experiencing the bliss of liberation. Okay, now at that time, there are 2 merchants named Tapusa and Balika who are traveling along a highway from Ukala, which corresponds to modern Odisha, to this district, to Magadha, the state where the Buddha was dwelling. And then the texts tell us, maybe this is a bit legendary, that a certain deity informed those two merchants that the Buddha, the Blessed One, has just attained enlightenment, and he's sitting at the foot of the Rajayatana tree. And the deity tells them, go serve the Blessed One, the Buddha, with some kind of barley gruel and honey balls, and that will be a source of blessing for you for a long time. And so the two merchants take their barley gruel and honey balls, they go to the Blessed One, and they offer him the barley and the honey balls. And the Buddha receives the barley and the honey balls and consumes them. Okay, then the two merchants, after the Buddha finishes his meal, they bow down to the Buddha and they say, we go to the Blessed One for refuge and to the Dhamma, not to the Sangha, because at this time there is no Sangha. There's just the Buddha. And somehow the Buddha must have given them some simple teaching, because there is a Dhamma to which they go for refuge. And so then they say, let the Blessed One accept us as lay disciples who have gone for refuge from this day forth for life. And thus these became the first lay disciples in the world, going for refuge with the two-word formula, Buddha and Dhamma as the refuge. Okay, now we come to a somewhat later time. Now the Buddha has gone to Benares, to the deer park at Benares. He has converted the 5 ascetics. They've all become sotapannas, first sotapannas, then arahats. And then somewhat later, a young man named Yasa, the son of a merchant, comes to the Buddha, encounters the Buddha in a park at Benares, and the Buddha teaches him the Dharma, and Yasa becomes a stream enterer. And then on attaining stream entry, Yasa requests the permission to become a monk. And so Yasa becomes a monk. And then Yasa's father, sounds like a familiar scene for some of us who have become monks in the West, comes searching for his son. Where is my son gone? He's run away out of the mansion, and it's a very wealthy family. He's gone to the deer park. And so Yasa's father comes to sees the Buddha. The Buddha sort of deliberately sets himself up on the path, intending for Yasa's father to meet him. And he asks the Buddha, he says, have you seen Yasa, this young man? And the Buddha says, sit down, householder. Perhaps while you're sitting here, you might see Yasa. And so the merchant sits down at a distance, and then the Buddha gives him a sequential talk. This is sort of the standard formula in the text. The Buddha begins with a talk on giving or generosity, talk on the precepts, talk on rebirth in heavens. Then he explains the impermanence, the emptiness of the pleasures of the senses, the benefits in renunciation. This is a sort of sequential talk to prepare the mind of the listener to gain confidence in the Buddha as the teacher. And so when the Buddha knows that the mind of this householder is ready, then the Buddha explains to him what is called the teaching special to the Buddhas. That is the Four Noble Truths, suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. And then the text says that just as a clean cloth will easily take dye, even so the dustless, stainless eye of the Dharma arose in the merchant. That eye of the Dharma, that is an expression meaning the attainment of stream entry. the vision, direct vision of the deathless element, nibbana, and the penetration of the Four Noble Truths. And so when this Yasa's father has now attained that vision of the Dhamma, he then says to the Buddha, excellent, excellent, Blessed One. And then he praises the Blessed One and praises the Dhamma. And then he says, I go to the Blessed One as refuge. I go for refuge to the Dhamma. I go for refuge to the Sangha. Let the Blessed One accept me as a lay disciple who has gone for refuge from this day forth for as long as life lasts. And so in this way, this merchant, Yasa's father, becomes the first lay disciple in the world to go for refuge using the three-phrase formula, that is going for refuge to all three jewels, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and somehow he must know that there is a Sangha, so he goes for refuge to the Sangha. There's probably a lot of factual information that actually took place that just didn't get included in the text, including how he had the idea that there is such a thing as the Sangha. Anyway, so the merchant becomes the first disciple to go for refuge to the three refuges. And then the merchant invites, at a later time, somewhat later, shortly afterwards, Yasa comes onto the scene, now as a monk. And since his father has now embraced the Dhamma, embraced the Sangha, so now, now the merchant is willing to accept that his son has become a monk. Oh, I'm not sharing the screen. Okay, I know how to do that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't see the control for share screen. Okay. That is sharing the screen. Oh, share screen options. Share screen options. That's not sharing the screen.
You don't want to share screen off, you just want to share. Go back to the share.
Okay.
More.
Okay.
And click on share. Just click on share. Don't do that. Just click on share.
Okay. And then share.
This screen now.
Okay, this whole screen. Okay. The voice.
Unmute.
And mute that.
Unmute. I'm sorry, mute yourself.
I'm muted. It says I'm muted.
No.
You could use this.
Please go on. Just fix it.
Okay. Is it okay, the sound?
Yes, Bhante.
Okay, that's good. And let us get the but now I've lost. Yeah. Go to that file again. Okay, now it's visible.
Yes.
Okay. And let us make it as large as possible. Can we go 200? Okay. Okay, sorry, so I'm so clumsy with this technology. Okay, so now the merchant's father, he's seen Yasa, he's accepted Yasa, and he invites the Buddha and the other monks to come to his mansion for the next day's meal. And so now in the morning, the Buddha dresses, takes his bowl and robe, and he goes to the house of the merchant with now the son, with the now called the Venerable Yasa as his attendant. And he sits down in the seat, and now the mother and the former wife of Yasa approach the Buddha, they greet him, and they sit down. And then I think the meal takes place, and then after the meal, the Buddha gives them the same kind of sequential talk. And as they are sitting there, they too gain the dustless, stainless vision of the Dhamma. Whatever is the nature of to arise, all that is of the nature to cease. And then they go to they take the three refuges. They go to the Buddha as refuge, to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha. And then they become the first women lay disciples in the world to go for refuge with the three phrase formula. So now we have the beginning of a lay community. We have the two merchants who had gone for refuge with two phrases. Yasa's father, the first male disciple to go for refuge with the three phrases, and Yasa's mother and his wife going for refuge with three phrases. Okay, now sometime later, now this is going to be the sort of expansion of the lay community. There is the king of the state of Magadha. His name was Bimbisara. The state of Magadha corresponds roughly to present-day Bihar in northeast India. And so when the Buddha, before his enlightenment, when he was a wandering ascetic, he had encountered King Bimbisara, and King Bimbisara had requested the Buddha, he said, if you become enlightened, please return to my kingdom and teach me the Dhamma that you have realized. And so the Buddha is going to honor that pledge that he made to King Bimbisara. So the Buddha, at a certain point, after he's starting to build up his community, both monastic and lay community, he goes back to Magadha and visits King Bimbisara. And so King Bimbisara comes to the Buddha, greets him, sits down at a certain distance. The text tells us 12 myriad Brahmins and householders. A myriad is 10,000. So anybody good in math, this would be 120,000. When you come across numbers in Indian Buddhist texts, you have to take them with a grain of salt, or let us say with 500 grains of salt. Okay. So anyway, there are a large number of Brahmins and householders who are attendants to King Bimbisara. And so they all go to visit the Buddha. And again, the Buddha gives the sequential talk. And again, he expounds the Four Noble Truths. And as the Buddha is expounding the Dhamma, then the officials of Magadha with Bimbisara as their head attain the dustless, stainless vision of the Dhamma, and one myriad, which I think is somewhat trustworthy because it didn't say all 12 myriads, but just one myriad, declare themselves to be lay followers. And amongst them is King Bimbisara himself, sees the Dhamma, attains the Dhamma, knows the Dhamma, plunges into the Dhamma, and he puts away doubt and attains full confidence in the Buddha. And now, first he expresses his appreciation to the Buddha, then he declares himself that he goes for refuge to the three jewels, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. He invites the Buddha to come the next day for a meal to the palace. And now this is a significant step that takes place in the next passage, that after the Buddha accepts the invitation, King Bimbisara, presumably he returns to the palace, and he starts to reflect that he has this park called the Bamboo Grove, which is not too far from any village, but not too near. It's suitable for seclusion. And he thinks, let me offer this bamboo grove to the Sangha headed by the Buddha. And so the next day, the Buddha, together with all of the monks, come to the palace for the meal. And then King Bimbisara takes a kind of golden ceremonial vessel and he pours the water over the hands of the Buddha. That's a kind of symbolic act to represent the donation of the bamboo grove to the Buddha. And he says, I give this bamboo grove to the Sangha headed by the Buddha. So he doesn't just give it to the Buddha personally, but he offers the grove to the entire Sangha headed by the Buddha, and then the Buddha accepts the bamboo grove. And has anybody here ever visited Rajgir in India?
Yes.
You've gone to the bamboo grove?
Yes, I
Yes,
went.
Bhante.
Yes.
If you've been there, you see that there's a kind of, please forgive the irreverence, but it's almost like a cartoon painting of King Bimbisara holding the golden ceremonial vessel, pouring the water over the hands of the Buddha, symbolizing the transfer of the bamboo grove to the Buddha. Yeah, now lots of people go to the bamboo grove because of its historical significance. Yeah, I was there in 2019 and it wasn't too crowded, but lots of people were milling around. But I had gone on pilgrimage to India in 1975 and I visited the bamboo grove. And at that time, nobody was there. I was there just alone. It was very, very moving to be in the bamboo grove with just myself, I think, the only person there. Okay, now comes another big development in the expansion of the Buddha's lay community. Okay, so this is the story of Anathapindika. And probably all of you who have read any Pali Buddha Sutta, in English translation, you read, thus have I heard at one time the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi at Anathapindika's park, Jeta's grove. So this is the story of how the Buddha came to acquire that park that belonged to that was offered by Anathapindika. Okay, now the Buddha is still dwelling at Rajagaha. This is the capital of the state of Magadha. He's still sort of in the territory of King Bimbisara. And there was a great merchant, another prominent merchant of Rajagaha. And Anathapindika was his brother-in-law. I guess Anathapindika must have been married to his sister. And so then Anathapindika was a resident of a different city, the city of Savatthi, which is much further to the north and towards the center of India. But Anathapindika came to Rajagaha for some business. He was a businessman, and he would stay, when he came to Rajagaha, he would stay at the home of his brother-in-law. And the previous day, this brother-in-law, great merchant of Rajagaha, had invited the Buddha and the monks for the next day meal. And the merchant was giving orders to his servants, telling him them to get up early in the morning, to cook various kinds of food. And Anathapindika arrives and he sees the house, his brother-in-law so busy preparing a very sumptuous, varied meal. And he's wondering, what's going on? Is my brother-in-law arranging a wedding ceremony or some great ceremony? Or has he invited the king and his retinue for the meal the next day? And so Anathapindika asks his brother-in-law, what's going on? Why are you so busy? And his brother-in-law said, I've invited the Buddha and his Sangha to come to my house for the next day's meal. And now this is the way the text present this. Anathapindika says, did you say Buddha? This is sort of a textual, dramatic representation of the encounter. And the merchant says, I said Buddha. Anathapindika still can't believe this. Am I hearing correctly? Did you say Buddha? I said Buddha. Did you say Buddha? Third time. Yes, I said Buddha. Then Anathapindika says, even this word Buddha, enlightened one, the awakened one, is so rarely heard in the world. Is it really possible to go and see this blessed one, the enlightened one, the Buddha? He's so eager, he wants to go right then and there. But the merchant says, this isn't the right time to go see him, because must be the nighttime when they're starting to prepare the food. But you can go tomorrow morning to see him. Okay, so Anathapindika lies down to sleep, but he's thinking so strongly about the Buddha that the text says 3 times he gets up in the night thinking, it's already morning. And he starts to prepare to go out to see the Buddha. But I think 3 times he turns back and goes back to sleep till finally the light starts to appear on the horizon. And he goes out. No, it's still dark, but the morning might be approaching. And then as he goes out, he has to go crossing through a cemetery, a little bit of a strange arrangement, but he gets frightened and he thinks of turning back. And then a certain yaksha, a spirit, invisible spirit, again, this is a textual dramatization of the incident, tells him 100 elephants, 100 horses, 100 chariots, 100,000 maidens adorned with precious jewels. These are not worth the 16th part of 1 step forward. Go forward, householder. Go forward. Don't turn back. Okay, so then the darkness fades away. The light appears. Anathapindika dispels his fear. And then finally, he approaches the grove where the Buddha is staying, and he sees the Buddha is pacing back and forth in the open air. And then the Buddha sees Anathapindika coming in the distance, and he sits down and he says to Anathapindika, "Come, Sudatta." Okay, now you see the point here is that Anathapindika was the name by which this merchant was most commonly known. But Anathapindika is not a proper name, but it's a kind of epithet, which means one who gives alms to the poor. And very few people knew his personal name. But his personal name was Sudatta. And so maybe it's like my case, like I'm known as Bhikkhu Bodhi, but somebody might go on, what is it called, Wikipedia, and find out my civilian name. But that would be a bit disrespectful and call me, "Come, Jeffrey." Okay. But he says, "Come, Sudatta." And Anathapindika is astonished that the Buddha calls me by my proper name. And then he's joyful and elated. And he bows down to the Buddha, but he's so nervous that he doesn't quite know what to say to the Buddha. So he comes up with a little trivial statement. He says, I hope that the Blessed One slept well. And then the Buddha replies with the verse, yes, always he sleeps well. The Brahmin, he calls himself a Brahmin, though technically he was not from the Brahmin caste, but he uses a Brahmin in a sense of a holy one, fully quenched, one who has removed all clinging, who's cool without attachments, one who has dispelled care or distress from the heart. He always sleeps well, having attained peace of mind. And then in the usual way, the Buddha gives this sequential talk to Anathapindika. Anathapindika attains the stainless eye of Dhamma, the vision of the Dhamma. He declares himself a lay disciple by going for refuge to the three jewels, etc., etc. And then he invites the Buddha to come to the merchant's house, to his brother-in-law's house for the next day's meal. It's not to his own house, which is in Savatthi, but he's going to sponsor the meal himself. And so the Buddha accepts, and Anathapindika goes back to the merchant's house, and the merchant, his brother-in-law, offers to sponsor the meal, but Anathapindika declines and says, no, I'm going to sponsor the meal myself. The urban council of Rajagaha hears about this and offers to sponsor the meal, but Anathapindika says, nothing doing, I'm going to sponsor it. King Bimbisara says, let me take care of it for you. Anathapindika says, no, I'm doing it. Okay, so Anathapindika, I guess he sends out, orders varieties of foodstuffs, has a sumptuous meal prepared. Then he offers the meal to the Buddha and to the order of monks. And now an idea occurs to Anathapindika. He realizes the Buddha has accepted this bamboo grove from Bimbisara. Let me try to do the same thing at Savatthi. And so he says to the Buddha, please accept a residence from me at Savatthi. You, together with the order of monks. And the Buddha sort of gives a hint. He says, the enlightened ones delight in empty places, quiet places. Maybe he knows that Savatthi is a very busy, at that time it was a major city, capital of the state of Kosala, and he doesn't want Anathapindika to set up a monastery on a busy highway, like off route of the Taconic Parkway or off Route 84. Okay, so he says, the Buddhas delight in quiet places. And Anathapindika gets the hint. And so he finishes his business in Rajagaha, he returns to Savatthi, and he looks all around, where can I find a suitable place to set up a monastery for the Buddha together with the Sangha. And he knows the requirements, not too far from a village so that the monks can all walk on alms round, but not too near so that they won't be disturbed by noise all the time. It's accessible to people when they want, but not crowded by day, quiet by night, a place suitable for meditation. And then as he's sort of scanning the area around Savatthi, he realizes that there's this pleasure grove belonging to the prince. This would be the son of King Cmty, Prince Jeta. And it meets all of the requirements, but one problem. It belongs to the prince, not to Anathapindika. So Anathapindika goes to the prince and says, give me the pleasure grove to make the monastery for the Buddha. The prince says, I won't give it away even for 100,000, let's say, dollars. This would be kahapana, the monetary unit of the time. But this is a little bit strange, but Anathapindika says, it's a deal. He said 100,000, I accept. The monastery, the grove is sold, the park is sold. The prince says it's not sold, and they have an argument. They go to the ministers of justice, who says, the prince said 100,000. Anathapindika says he accepts. So the deal is cemented. Anathapindika gets the park. So Anathapindika then, he lays out gold coins over the park in order to accumulate the money to give to the prince. And it covers the entire grove except for one little area, one small open space near the porch. And then Anathapindika tells his servants, go get more gold coins. But the prince says, enough, you've laid out enough for the park. Let me cover the space with gold, and that will be my gift. Okay, so in this way, Anathapindika gains the Jeta's Grove. He builds all sorts of residents, and then he invites the Buddha to come to Savatthi, and he sort of ushers the Buddha together with the Sangha into the Jeta's Grove, now called Anathapindika's Park. And that is how the Buddha came to accept this park, which became his chief residence throughout the rest of his teaching career. So he spent many of the rains retreats at this Anathapindika's Park in Savatthi. And so many of the suttas that we read take place in Anathapindika's Park. Who has visited the park?
I did, Bhante.
Okay, some
The-
of you have visited. Yes.
Yeah, in January I visited.
Yeah, I visited in 1975, and there was a monk in charge telling me, this is where Sariputta's kuti was. This is where Moggallana's kuti
Yeah, Buddha's Kuti too. Yeah.
was. Okay, anyway. Okay, so now this was a sort of historical overview of the development of the lay community. And now I compiled a number of suttas which show how the Buddha included the lay community as an essential part of his, we call the dispensation of the sasana. And so here we have a sutta in which he says that there are 4 kinds of persons who, when they're competent, disciplined, self-confident, learned, experts on the Dhamma, practicing in accordance with the Dhamma, they adorn the Sangha. So who are those 4 types of people? There's the bhikkhu, that's the monk, who's competent, disciplined, and so on. A bhikkhuni, who's competent, disciplined. The male follower, lay follower, that's the upasaka, who is competent. And the female lay follower, the upasika, who is competent, disciplined, self-confident, learned, expert on the Dhamma, really expert on the Dhamma, practicing in accordance with the Dhamma. So all 4 of them adorn the Sangha. Okay, then I come to a kind of questionnaire on what makes one a lay disciple and the distinctive characteristics of a lay disciple. So this is Mahanama, who is, I think, the Buddha's cousin, a member of the Sakyan clan. He comes to the Buddha and asks the Buddha, in what way is one a lay follower? What is sort of the defining mark of the lay follower? So the defining mark is one who has gone for refuge to the Buddha, gone for refuge to the Dhamma, gone for refuge to the Sangha. That is what makes one a lay follower, upasaka or upasika. Okay, but Mahanama asks some more questions. In what way is a lay follower accomplished in sila, in good conduct, in virtuous conduct? And so now the Buddha speaks about what are called the 5 precepts or the 5 training rules. The lay follower abstains from killing, from stealing, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, and from wines and other intoxicants. So in that way, the lay follower is silava, that is accomplished, or sila sampanno, accomplished in good conduct, virtuous conduct. Then Mahanama asks, in what way is a lay follower accomplished in faith, in saddha? And you would think that when going for refuge, that would seem to imply possessing faith. But maybe the idea here, this is my assumption, maybe there were many members of the second family who saw our cousin or nephew or elder, the Siddhartha has become the Buddha, and so many of our relatives are going for refuge for him. You know, we can't be embarrassed by holding back, so we go for refuge. So they go for refuge, but maybe they're not really endowed with faith. Or maybe people just go for refuge out of blind faith. Anyway, so he asks, how is a lay follower accomplished in faith? And so the Buddha says, the lay follower places faith in the enlightened one of the Tathagata. That is a designation for the Buddha, that the Blessed One is an Arahat, and then we have the 9 epithets. Arahat, fully enlightened one, possessed of good conduct, of knowledge and good conduct, and so on. He is the teacher of the deities and human beings, the enlightened one, the Blessed One. So that's how the lay followers accomplished in faith. Next question, how is the lay follower accomplished in generosity? This would be chaga. And then the Buddha answers, again, this is a kind of stock formula, that the lay follower dwells at home with a mind devoid of the stain of miserliness or stinginess. He's generous, open-handed, one who delights in relinquishment, one who is devoted to charity, delighting in giving and sharing. So that's how the lay follower is accomplished in generosity. So these 2, okay, so we have sila and chaga, generosity. Then Mahanama asks, how is the lay follower one accomplished in wisdom, in panya, or prajna? And then the Buddha says, the lay follower is wise. He possesses the wisdom directed to arising and passing away. This is the wisdom that sees into the impermanence of all conditioned things, the insight that all conditioned things are impermanent, subject to arising and vanishing. And that is a wisdom that's said to be noble and penetrative, that leads to the complete extinction of dukkha. So in that way, the lay follower is accomplished in wisdom. Okay, so those are some of the essential qualities of the lay disciple, not only going for refuge, but having virtuous conduct, having faith in the enlightenment of the Buddha, practicing generosity, and being accomplished in the wisdom of insight and the wisdom, the penetrative wisdom. Okay, then I took another passage which shows that the Noble Eightfold Path is accessible to all. So here the Buddha says that whether it's a lay person or a monastic, I don't praise the wrong way. So whether it's one who is practicing wrong,
I did.
Wait, I think I mixed up the text. Let's just go to the positive side. Whether it's a layperson or a monastic, what I praise is the right way. Whether it's a lay person or a monastic who is practicing rightly, one undertaking the right way of practice. Yeah, oh, whether it's a lay person or a monastic who is practicing rightly, one undertaking the right way of practice attains the correct path, the Dhamma that is wholesome. And what is that right way of practice? It is the Noble Eightfold Path that is from right view to right concentration. So whether it's a lay person or a monastic who is practicing rightly, one undertaking the right way of practice attains that correct path, the wholesome Dhamma. Yeah, to save time, I'm going to skip over some passages. Yeah, but this is interesting. You know, we know the name of Anathapindika because he is the one who was so generous in supporting the Buddha and the Sangha. But there's a sutta in which the Buddha names his foremost lay disciples. And so he says, a male lay follower endowed with faith, rightly aspiring, should aspire thus, may I become like Cmty the householder and Hattika of Alavi, not Anandapindika. Anandapindika was generous, but not the highest in his practice and attainment. But Cmty the householder and Hattika of Alavi were both disciples who had reached the third stage along the path to liberation, the stage of non-returning. And Cmty the householder was very knowledgeable about the Dhamma, so that sometimes he could even trip up the monks by asking them subtle questions on the Dhamma. So some of the elder monks couldn't even answer. So Cmty has to hint to them, what is the answer to these questions? And then also there are two foremost female lay disciples. I'll skip over the list. Later, I'll send out this file so everybody can have it. But the Buddha announces his two foremost female lay followers. One is Kujuttara, and the other is named Velu Kantika Nandamata. And what's interesting is that Kujuttara was a servant woman in a palace. And the thing is, you see, the women of the palace couldn't, because of the taboos of the time, maybe it's a little bit like, I don't know, like Iran or Afghanistan today, not as severe, but so the women of the palace couldn't go out individually to listen to the Buddha preach. Maybe at times they could go out in a group, or the Buddha would come to the palace to preach. But when the Buddha was preaching, this would be not in the major centers. I think there was the state of Udena. So the women of the palace would send their servant woman, Kujuttara, out to listen to the Buddha preach or teach. And apparently Kujuttara had a very good memory. And then she would come back to the palace and she would report what she had heard to the women of the palace. And Kujuttara reached the stage of non-returner. And the teachings that she heard from the Buddha and reported to the women of the palace came to be collected into one of the books of the Pali Canon, the smaller collections called the Iti Vuttaka. Okay, then I took another passage which shows that the Buddha praises the women, both men and women lay followers, who attain the paths and the fruits. And so there is a wanderer named Vajragota who is questioning the Buddha. And in his questioning, the Buddha has said that there are monks and nuns who have reached the stage of arhatship, non-returning, the lower stages. And now Vajragota asks, is there any one male lay disciple and later one female lay disciple leading a life of celibacy and to reach, this is a result of reaching the third stage, which involves the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, including sensual desire, who will be reborn spontaneously in the higher realms, the form realm, and there attain final nibbana without ever returning from that world. And the Buddha says, again, you have to be a little skeptical about numbers in the text. There are not only 100 or 500, but far more male lay followers leading lives of celibacy who have reached the destruction of the 5 lower fetters and who will be reborn in the higher realms and there attain final nibbana without ever returning from that world. And then, is there any one male lay disciple clothed in white, enjoying sensual pleasures, not necessarily leading a life of celibacy, who follows your instructions and so on, who has gone beyond doubt, become free from perplexity, and who has become perfectly established in your teaching? Those are the criteria of once returner and stream enterer. And again, the Buddha says even more than 500 male lay followers who have reached that attainment. And then the same questions with regarding the female lay followers. More than 500 who have been reborn, who will be reborn in the pure abodes and there attain final nibbana, and more than 500 I think I mixed up. Yeah, it should be more than 500 female lay followers who are enjoying sensual pleasures, not leading lives of celibacy, who have become independent of others, fully established in your teaching. Yeah, this is where it is. And then Vajragota says, he praises the Buddha. He says, just as the river Ganges inclines towards the sea, slopes towards the sea, flows towards the sea, and merges with the sea, so too Master Gautama's assembly, with its homeless ones and its householders, inclines towards Nibbana, slopes towards Nibbana, flows towards Nibbana, and merges with Nibbana. So those are beautiful words of praise, showing that it's the entire assembly, whether monastics or lay disciples. And these are the ones who have reached the paths and the fruits, who are flowing towards Nibbana and then merging with Nibbana. And I think this will be the last passage I have here. So this is at the time when we're coming to the end of the Buddha's life, and the Buddha is contemplating whether it is time for him to pass away. And then Mara now comes to the Buddha to make that request for the Buddha to pass away. And Mara says to the Buddha, long ago, the Blessed One spoke these words to me. Apparently, this is set after the Buddha attained enlightenment and before he started to teach. So this is not recorded actually in the Pali Canon, but this seems to be being projected back to that period when the Buddha was undecided about whether to go out and teach. It seems that Mara came to the Buddha and said, why go out and teach? There's a lot of trouble. You're just going to create a lot of difficulties and hardship for yourself. Take it easy, man. Just chill out, and you could, just enjoy the bliss of liberation for yourself. And, you could go on alms round in the nearby villages. You could sit experiencing the bliss of liberation. And then when the time comes, you pass away into nirvana. But then the Buddha says to Mara at that time, he says, I won't attain parinibbana, I won't pass away until there are bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, monk and nun disciples, laymen and laywomen who have become my true disciples, who are wise, well-disciplined, capable and learned, preservers of the Dhamma, living according to the Dhamma, abiding by the appropriate conduct, and who have learned the word of the Master and can expound it, preach it, proclaim it, establish it, reveal it, explain it in detail, and make it clear, who could refute adverse opinions, opposing opinions, and skillfully expound this convincing and liberating Dhamma. And so now Mara says, now all of that has come to pass. You have acquired disciples, both monks and nuns, laymen and laywomen who have all of those qualities. So now it's time for you to pass away. The time has come for your parinibbana. Yeah, so I think at this point now the Buddha says to Mara, don't be worried, Mara. I've made up my mind. I'm now 80 years of age, and I have disciples who have met all of these qualifications. And so now, 3 months from now, I'm going to pass away into nirvana. And then Mara is happy and vanishes from the scene. Okay, so that takes care of this kind of overview of the development of the lay community. I think we can take maybe a 5-minute or 10-minute little break, and then we can do some meditation. Yeah, I've gone over time, but we had a slow start. So and is everybody hearing me okay? People who are online?
Yes,
Perfect.
fine.
Yes, it's
Dante.
fine. Thank you very much.
Okay, finally we
Yes,
set.
very clear,
Okay,
Dante.
okay, so I'm going to put the recording on hold. Okay, so I'll pause the recording. Okay.